Hi, good day. This is Justin Pineda, and for today, we're going to discuss Module 2, which is Operational and Organizational Security. Okay, so why organizational security? So all security mechanisms are dictated by the organization's goals. So regardless whether your IT security team is very skilled or talented, without the support of the management, then it doesn't matter. Okay, the security program will not be given proper support. So organization's priority will be the basis of your operational security. So why is security program important? And when we compare it with the role of the technical people, you will wonder why there's a need for a CISO. Okay? Why are they paid way higher compared to the technical guys, where when in fact the technical guys are the ones who are doing the legwork and majority of the dirty work. Um, so later on we'll learn about why um, why the role of the creator of the security program is important. So we go to security program first. It's the totality of technologies, processes, procedures, metrics, training, and personnel. So again, when we talk about the technical people, we only talk about the skill on the technology. Okay? But the security program talks about the totality of this, the process, the people, the training, the metrics, the procedures, etc. Okay, and it must be based on organization security policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. So the organizational security will determine how strict will um, your security program will be. Uh, like for example, it depends. Like for example, you work in a bank, definitely the organizational security will be very strict. Will enforce the highest level of security for almost all layers, right? Um, but if you go to a different type of industry, like for example, agriculture, right? The security program might not be as strict as the banks. Right? So, policy standards, guidelines, and procedures. So, when we say policies, these are high-level, broad statements, okay, that are created by at the top management. Okay, those C levels. So they say what the policies are, and they do not know how to specifically implement it. It's just a high-level, broad statement. So we go to standards. These are mandatory elements regarding the implementation of a policy. So sometimes we pattern our policy based on specific standards. Organizations will follow certain standards to say that they are of quality. Okay? That to maintain a specific level of security, we follow specific ISO standards. And that if we follow this, then we are at par with um, the same organizations that have the same standard. Okay, so it becomes the baseline. The third would be the guidelines. So when we say guidelines, these are recommendations regarding a policy. So this is not mandatory. Okay? These are just guides. And last would be procedures. So procedures are your step-by-step instructions on how to do the policy. Okay, so the technical guys will do the procedures on how um, to implement the policies. Okay, so So the operational model, you plan, adjust for security, you implement the plans, you monitor the implementation, and evaluate the effectiveness. So if you will see, the role of the CISO or the Chief Information Officer would be the entire operational model of security from the planning, implementation, monitoring, and then evaluation, and then you go back to adjusting the security, whether or not it's effective or not. Okay, so why is it that the CISO is paid way higher compared to the technical the technical personnel? It's because it's the CISO who will be accountable if the security program, the overall security program fails. Okay? So the consequences will be faced by the head. Okay? And also the good or the advantage of having uh, a chief level officer in security is that has a say um, he has a say on security matters on a strategic level. Okay? Because that's the usual challenge to defend what what the technical guys would think um, are important to implement. So the CISO is able to articulate these things. Okay, so we go to vulnerability testing versus penetration testing. So when we say vulnerability testing, it talks about finding the weaknesses. So usually you use a scanner to do that. And then when we say penetration testing, it's the actual active attack simulation. So we will be doing a lot of vulnerability testing and penetration testing in a different topic. Okay, but just to put this in context for organizational security, um, in some organizations they require VAPT or vulnerability assessment and pen testing against assets to determine its security posture. So um, let's go to logical access controls. So here, access control list controls the physical access. Okay. While the logical access controls grants access to specific people who are authorized. Okay. These are mechanisms used to control who may gain access to organization's computer system and network. So usually, these are some of the examples of logical access controls. We have tokens. Okay. So aside from we discussed in module 1 the multi-factor authentication. So aside from um, password, okay, which is something that you need to have something that you have, okay, to prove that it's really you. So that's another layer. So you input a passcode that expires. Although nowadays it's more prevalent when you download authenticator apps and tying them up with your applications like Facebook, social networking, or social media accounts already have that. So group policy allows administrator to organize users based on groups or categories. So Um, why is it important to implement a group policy? Okay. So we would like to make um, consistent enforcement of directed controls or administrative controls. So the good thing about group policy is that you can create your list of policies and then implement them all throughout the network, and it will be applied to all workstations that are part of the organization. So you can implement specific password policies, You cannot use the USBs, you cannot install specific, um, you can only have limited applications running, okay? You cannot install certain applications, etc. So it will be implemented all throughout, okay, to all workstations that are part of the organization. Okay? And that is actually the key, okay, consistency for all. Okay, so now let's go to password policy. So it's important because passwords are the most common authentication mechanism. And among the three common types of authentication, it's the weakest, okay, type. That's why you have these characteristics: password length. Okay, so you have a minimum number or minimum length of your password, complexity, combination of alphanumeric or symbols or special characters, account lockout, the threshold before your account locks out, a minimum password age, and then your maximum password age, and then password history. So usually in the group policy, you put um, specific values for age. Okay, so briefly, let's answer this. Who is the management protecting from when they implement the following? So for password length, obviously we're protecting it against intruders, because we say that if the password is, the length is higher, okay, then it's harder for the intruder to crack the password. Let's say I require you to input 10. Okay. Complexity, obviously the more complex it is, then it's harder for the intruder to get in. So if I say there's alphanumeric, letters, numbers, you even need to use the uppercase and then symbols, then it will be harder. Okay. Account lockout would be your threshold. So if I say 3, after 3 consecutive failed login attempts, it will lock out. Okay. Um, Minimum password age, this is um, yeah, the minimum number of days before the user can change his password. So you can put in 5. Maximum password age can be 30, every 30 days. And then password history, I cannot use the last X password, number of passwords, or the last 5 passwords that I used before. Okay. So among these, okay, so the answers, okay, to the question, who is the management protecting from when they implement password length? It's the hacker. Password complexity is the hacker, as mentioned. Account lockout, hacker. Okay, maximum password age, hacker, because if you have an expiry, then the time that the time where when the hacker is about to crack the password, then the user will be required to change the password. So okay, password history, also the hacker, because you cannot repeat the use of the password you used before, no? But for the minimum password age, that's the only um, characteristic of the password policy that is made for the user, okay, or protect that is created by the management to protect from the user. Okay, why? Because if you do not set your minimum password age, so let's go to the next slide. If this is not set, the user can change his password n times. So the password history will will be useless now, because I can change, so that the moment that I am required to change the password, I can be able to change the password n times. So for example, if my password history is 5, I will repeat it 5 times. I will change it 5 times, and then I can go back to my old password within the same day. Okay. So the user can change his password n times until he can use his current password. It will defeat the purpose of a changed password. Okay. So another issue would be account lockout. So this policy should be carefully thought of on implementation. Okay, so permanently locking the account can be intentionally used against the legitimate user. So for example, I know the username of the person. Okay, I will intentionally input a wrong password, and then the moment that he enters his own password, and he can no longer access because he's locked out. And he will have to call the support, and then I will intentionally input incorrect passwords again. So that would be an issue. Okay. Some other policies would be time of day restrictions. So some systems allow for specification of time of day, okay, in their access control policies. So for strict, so again, we mentioned depends on the industry. Okay, so some organizations would be um, very strict, like banks, who cannot access after this time. Okay, although this is not um, a pro admin policy, because management would like you to work and work and work, right? So this is against the advantages of management. File and print resources. So the issue, sharing high profile files to users. Okay, so the problem with network printers is that when the user when the user prints his or her file, the the the, the file itself will be stored temporarily in the network printer. So there's a temporary storage there where potentially other people can open it. Okay? And the usual issue would be getting or accidentally getting the, the printed document that is not yours. So that's another issue. Okay. Another issue would be change management. So um, this one is very important because it ensures proper procedures are followed when modifications to the IT infrastructure are made. So it involves review and approval of requests and examination of consequences. So here, um, this is very common for the IT processes, not only for cybersecurity. But an example would be if um, you're required to permit certain services in the firewall. Okay? So you cannot just, even if you are skilled and you know how to add policies in the firewall, you cannot directly change the configuration there. It has to go to change management process because all stakeholders must agree to the change and ensure that no other um, no other issue will be encountered with the changes, or if there are any, there will be corresponding actions to be done. And then classification of information. So we already discussed this in the previous um, module. So classifying, putting on labels, okay, and determining who can access it. Okay. So let's go to acceptable use policy, or AUP. So it outlines what the organization considers to be the appropriate use of company resources such as computer systems, email, internet, and networks. So this is very important because a lot of employees, this is in the real world, a lot of employees are penalized for violating acceptable use policy, or AUP, ranging from reprimand all the way to termination. Okay? Because in the AUP, it explicitly states what you should or should not do. Like, for example, are you allowed to um, stream uh, stream videos, or use your social media accounts during, not even during work hours, during break time. Are you allowed to do that? Okay. Are you allowed to use your USB, plug it in the computer? Okay. In some organizations, they're very strict. Okay, that when you use um, a flash drive or your USB stick, then that's a ground for suspension. So you have to carefully read the AUP in your organization. Usually, okay, the AUP is signed together with your contract. So you have to review the contents of the AUP. Okay. So under the AUP would be the IUP, or the Internet Usage Policy. So it ensures the maximum employee productivity and limit potential liability to the organization from inappropriate use of the internet in the workplace. So some other issues like posting work-related topics on social networking sites. Is that okay? It will be um, included in the AUP or the IUP. Okay. EUP which is also under the AUP, or the email usage policy. It's related to the internet usage policy, the types of message that can be sent. Okay. Non-work traffic should be allowed or not. Are you allowed to use the corporate email to sell your goods, or to send email, non-work emails using the company email? Okay, will that be allowed? It is defined in the EUP. Okay, so let's now go to due care and due diligence. So due care and due diligence, okay, these both address the issues where one party's actions may have caused damage or injury to another. So this is not just a term for information security, but for other disciplines as well, especially for labor, or um, usually um, in various cases. So when we say due care, is the minimum customary practice of responsible protection of assets, um, and due diligence, it's the prudent management and execution of due care. So what's the example of this? For example, there's an employee under the marketing department creating, um, searching for some ideas or pictures in the internet that will be used for an ad, and then suddenly um, he was redirected to a malware site. Okay, and the computer got infected, etc., etc. Now the HR now sent a memo, okay, stating that the employee violated the AUP because he went to a prohibited site. Okay. So the question now would be, did the organization exercise due diligence to ensure that, number one, the employee is informed um, that he or she should not go to prohibited websites, and number two, did they exercise due diligence to ensure that these policies will be implemented properly? So, because the employee is just doing his job, right? So, that's the issue. And when you look at it, you will say, later on, you will realize that not it's not only enough that you have a policy, okay? Um, because it can happen um, accidentally, right? Browsing, and then suddenly you're being redirected, etc. Okay, so the policy very um, may not be explained very clearly. The procedures on how to work properly may not be explained in detail. At the same time, when you say due care, okay, that's the minimum customary practice of responsible protection. Okay. Did you implement the correct um, controls to stop this type of damage? So you will now ask, do you have an antivirus in the workstation to protect the workstation of the employee? Okay. Do you have a proxy firewall or application firewall to block this type of access to unknown malicious website, etc.? So this will be the question. So that's due diligence and due care. So if the answer here is, did you exercise due diligence? No. Did you exercise due care? No. Then the one to be blamed is the organization. Okay, so that's the usual application of due care and due diligence. Okay. Due process is guaranteeing fundamental fairness, justice, and liberty in relation to an individual's legal rights. So again, this is not only for information security, but for other departments as well, the teams. Okay, so due process for all. You cannot just fire somebody. You cannot just penalize somebody without getting his or her side. Okay, and going to a process of investigating and giving impartial judgment. So separation of duties, we discussed this in module 1. Okay. It ensures that no single individual has the ability to conduct transactions alone. Then we also have disposal and destruction. We'll be discussing this in, I think, module 8, okay, in detail. But in organizations, in big organizations, they have policies for disposal and destruction. Okay. In the school, for example, the papers, um, the school papers, test papers, projects submitted by students are used as scratch papers, and that's normal. But in some companies, especially banks, you're not allowed to use that as scratch paper, even if it's the only front. It's the only use page is the front page. You cannot use the back page. It will be shredded. Crisscross shredder is used. So you would say it's a waste of paper. You can maximize this, but no. And that's part of the policy. In some cases, it's burned. Okay. And not only paper. So some organizations reuse or donates. Some organizations donate their computers. So they have a process of purging. Okay. Um, the hard disk. Okay. Some they completely destroy the hard disk. Okay. So it depends on the policy. Okay. Privacy policy explains the guiding principles in guarding personal data, especially customers. Okay. So that is in the perspective of a certification exam. Okay. But with a lot of amendments and the development of privacy laws around the world. Okay. Everyone, all organizations, regardless whether it's small or enterprise, must have safeguards um, for personal information that they process, whether it is customers, their employees, or former employees, and others. Okay. Third party information that are personal in nature. So that's the coverage of the privacy policy. So we'll discuss that more in detail in Module 3. Okay, so we go to SLA, Service Level Agreement. These are contractual agreements between entities describing specified levels of service that the servicing entity agrees to guarantee for the customer. So here, in IT, you know this. Okay? There is a promise, a commitment that you will be able to provide this level of service. Okay? That when an incident happens, there is a response time of X minutes. Okay? Depending on the severity. So everything is calculated. There's a value, there's a time, there's an expected response. Okay. Now let's go to human resource policies. Now, human resource policies in a way overlap with organizational security because um, when you do background checks, okay, during hiring or promotion, you're actually doing both probably preventive or detective control. So if you do background checks prior from the employee being hired, or yeah, that is a preventive because you're trying to check whether there are issues with the person. Okay, background checks during employment, that's detective. You're trying to audit the person, right? So in a way, human resource policies overlap with security policies. And that's normal. Okay, so they work hand in hand. So there's also promotions. So when you promote somebody, you add privileges to that person. Okay? But you have to audit still. Because it doesn't mean that if you add privileges, the previous privileges are also needed. So you have to check which among these privileges are no longer needed and have to remove it. Okay? Or reducing privileges if the person moves to a different department or gets demoted. And for retirement, separation, and termination of employee, so HR policies must be clear because an employee leaving the company can either have positive or negative action. Either he found a better company, or he was fired, or he's disgruntled. Okay. So must be able to determine the risk if the employee becomes disgruntled as a result of action. So in other countries like the States, when you get fired or when you quit, that's your last day. However, here in the Philippines, it doesn't work that way. You have to render 30 days okay, notice, etc. Depends on the contract, sometimes 60 days. Okay. So the HR policy must be clear because if the person is disgruntled, he or she may be stealing data or probably planting logic bombs, etc. So, Code of Ethics so describes the expected behavior of the members from a high-level standpoint. So, we'll discuss this more on Module 3. Okay, so now let's go to social engineering. So, a lot of the security policies are created to prevent, detect, and respond against social engineering attacks. So, as we know, social engineering is an attack where it leverages the human's tendency to trust, right? So here, the emphasis is the people because in social engineering, the lesson here is that humans are the weakest link in the security chain. Okay, so we have the software, the hardware, and the people. We call it the wetware. The wetware problem because when you deploy a firewall, if you have policies here that says allow web traffic, it will allow. If it's not web traffic, it will not allow. There are no exceptions. But if it's a person, like for example, a guard, security guard, okay, and the policy is no ID, no entry. And then at one point you see somebody has no ID, but because I know the person is an employee, I will still allow him or her to get in. Okay, so there's an exemption. Okay. But we do not know the entire story. Probably the person has already resigned. It's no longer an employee, but he or she was able to enter and then steal some stuff. And then so there are a lot of stories. Anyway, okay, so the definition from SANS is that it's social engineering is the hacker or attacker's clever manipulation of the natural human tendency to trust, to obtain information that will allow him to gain unauthorized access to a valued system. And according to the successful attacks to the system, majority of the successful attacks are based from social engineering, not with the sophisticated tools that you have. Okay, because why would I use a password cracker when I can just ask the ask the person the password, right? Using some social engineering skills. Okay. So some of the social engineering attacks include phishing, vishing, farming, spam, shoulder surfing. So um, shoulder surfing, piggybacking, dumpster diving are physical physical social engineering attacks. We'll discuss these types of attacks in the next module and hoaxes. So when we say phishing, vishing, you try uh, to fool the person, okay, by sending pretending that it came from a legit source and then asking the person to do something like click a link or um, give out confidential information. Okay. Farming is a large-scale phishing targeting an organization. Okay. So we'll discuss this further in the next lesson. Okay. And then we have social engineering steps. There are three steps in social engineering. The first one is information gathering, which is simply researching about the target. Okay. Doing impersonation, doing dumpster diving, literally diving in the target's garbage to determine what he or she eats, what he or she likes, etc. So stalking the target, determining the patterns of travel, routines, etc. And then second step would be building relationships based on what you learned in information gathering stage. And then the third is exploitation. Because you already know during the information gathering stage what the person's vulnerabilities are, you try to exploit it. Like for example, you know that the person has a lot of debt, and then when you exploit it, you will try to lend him money in exchange for certain information, or you know that the person or the target is um, close to being fired, and then during the exploitation stage, you will do psychological triggers like threaten that you will um, you will escalate or you will tell his or her boss her about her performance or something, okay, in exchange for something. So these are the social engineering steps. Okay. So what are the countermeasures for social engineering? Countermeasures to social engineering. So again, we go back to organizational security. So you create, implement, and harden security policies. Comply with physical security standards. Okay, so this is very tricky because In some organizations, the security policies are templated. They copy paste it from SANS or whatever very good organizations. But implementation is bad or terrible. So the policies become useless. And then third would be security awareness training for all employees. So you have to remind them every time. Okay? Train them every time. Next would be resistance training for specified employees. So the usual vulnerable people are those in the front line. The receptionists, the guards, the IT support. So they're the ones who are prone to, or the usual subjects or targets of social engineering attacks. So you have to um, train them not to give away information, personal information, do a lot of validation, etc. Okay, and the next would be reminders all over the place. Okay, not to post um, personal information in social media, etc. Okay, not to use post-it when not to write your passwords in the post-it, then stick it in the table on the table. Okay. Next would be social engineering landmines or SELM. So this is a term used in SANS. So there are a lot of landmines that you can use to detect or to catch social engineers or intruders. Okay. Some of the examples include there has to be a know-it-all officer who checks the place around and then reports unusual people, unusual behavior. Okay. Having a centralized security log, doing callbacks. Like for example, if somebody calls the receptionist and the person asks for sensitive information and probably pretends to be the president or the CEO, okay, the receptionist will say, "Okay, I will call you back with the number that I have in my record." So once the receptionist calls back and the real president receives the call, then okay, you already have determined that it's a social engineering attack. Okay. Key and bogus question. So before you give information, you ask key and bogus question. And then last would be incident response. So once you catch the social engineer, what will you do? Obviously, you call the police or you call the authorities to for further action. Okay, so this wraps up the module 2, operational and organizational security. So for this module, to summarize, we discussed the importance of organizational security, um, why a security program is important, and why it's important to have a leader or um, a CISO who can help explain to the management the importance of cybersecurity. Because the usual perception of management to IT and cybersecurity is that it's a cost center because it does not bring money, and the technologies that are suggested to be implemented are very expensive. So it's important to have somebody who can articulate it to the management why these things are important. Okay. And we also discussed the different types of policies, some examples of the policies that we have. We discussed about care and due diligence, due process. We discussed about the HR policies and its overlap, um, uh, the overlap with some of our security policies. And then we also discussed about social engineering in general and ways to uh, prevent and respond to these social engineering attacks. So there we have it. Okay, and then if you have any questions, you can send me an email or put your questions in the comments section. And thank you so much for listening. See you in the next module.